all that good stuff. So I am going to try to remember, how do I share my screen? There it is, right here. Okay, I'm sharing that. So I have a little PowerPoint presentation for y'all.
There you are.
Sorry.
I'm in the first move. I can't find my hearing. It went up. I went up to my little case. It's not there. I'm not going to be like you to do. The only thing I can think of is it's in the bed. But
sorry. Hold on one second. I think we're having an issue with the Zoom. I'm trying to figure this out. Okay. Let's see. I was trying to see if I could have the chat window open and present at the same time. Oh, there it is. There's my chat window. Hi, everyone. So I have a little presentation for everybody to follow along here. And I am going to try to build in some time for Q&A at the end. But please feel free to submit questions in the chat as we go along the presentation. If it's something that I need to go into a little more detail about, happy to do so. I live in New York City, so I apologize in advance if you hear a passing motorcycle or garbage truck or any other traffic noise. If it gets really bad, I have my headphones in and hopefully that will cut down noise. Like I said, as we go along to the presentation, feel free to put some questions in the chat to everyone. And, if it's something I should go into more detail, I'll answer. Otherwise, we can save it for the end. But yeah, let's get started. Okay. So basically this presentation, I'm here giving you the overview so you know what we're going to cover. And essentially, I'm trying to give you guys also the agent's POV, because I know if you're querying or you're about to start querying, I'm sure you've heard a lot about just, how intense the process can be, especially it feels like you're throwing things out into the void and you're not getting responses back. So trying to shed some light on what that may be from the agent's perspective. And we're going to go through what is the anatomy of a query letter. Again, if you've been querying for a while, you may already know some of these basics. And if you're just about to go querying for the first time, this is definitely something important information you should have. We're going to also cover do's and don'ts of query letters. There's basic mistakes that I see a lot of the times, and definitely don't want to be doing this. You want to have an agent read your query letter and not knock it because of, you didn't put your best foot forward. And the same way, we are also going to cover opening pages from my point of view. Personally, what grabs my attention and, what makes the opening pages effective or ineffective. And then also going to cross over a little bit to what now, maybe you've been querying for a while and you're not getting responses. And so trying to figure out maybe what that is. And like I mentioned, I'm going to try to build some time for Q&A at the end, and then hopefully we can address some specific questions or concerns that people might be experiencing. People keep it coming into the meeting room. It's very exciting. All right, so querying process from the agent's point of view. So a little bit about me. I am the subsidiary rights director at JABberwocky Literary Agency. So in addition to agenting, I manage sub-rights for my agency, which covers translation rights and audio rights. So I'm a little bit different than some literary agents who do agenting full-time, because I divide my workload between agenting stuff and, as I mentioned, sub-right stuff. So my client list is small. I've been at JABberwocky for 5 years, and my list is still about a dozen people, which is kind of small to me at least. And I do that because I have to be mindful of the workload that I have to make sure that I am going to give any new client that I offer representation to the time, energy, and support that they need. Because I don't want to be overextending myself, and I want to be helping an author throughout their whole career process, not just for a specific book. So as I'm looking through my query box or going through conferences and workshops, looking for potential clients, that's something in the back of my mind is, is this a person that I want to be working for the next 5-10 years? Are we going to be working well? Do they seem like they're a polished enough writer that I won't have to do as much editorial work as it might be? Because, although I am a very hands-on editorial person, It's much easier to work when you were like at the 75% line versus at the 25% line. You know, there's just a very big difference in time and energy. All of your writers know that your very first draft is very different from like your second or third revision sometimes. So what I'm trying to look for, when I look for clients, I'm trying to find the person who's already at the second, third revision, because that's the time we'll get closest to getting them to go on submissions. So to give you some point of views, so I opened a query manager. I signed up. Some of you, if you are querying, you may already be familiar with Query Tracker, which helps you, you know, when you submit to an agent, you get to see like, you know, if that's been accepted or not, how much time has come between when they read and when they replied to your work. So as you can see, this is from September 22nd. I opened my box on September 1st. So already I had like about 495 queries, actually maybe 500 if you count that August that came in, trickled in at midnight when it was still August. And so you can see the blue is the stuff I have not replied to at the moment. The red is the stuff I rejected. That's like about 316. And then 2 people in green were people whose material I actually requested. And so why, out of all those people, why did those 2 green people get in when so many of the red people did not? So most obvious reasons why I reject a query: it's badly written. It's not clear about the plot, the characters, the genre. Oftentimes people tell me what the story is about without actually telling me the story. You can kind of imagine if you are talking to someone about a TV show and you are not describing the TV show, if that makes any sense. You know, they're always like, my story is, it's about this guy who does this thing. And it's like a really cool guy. Like he's really popular. He's like this cool dude. And, you know, it's all these extra details that are not really relevant where, you might be listening to someone like, okay, but like, what's the actual plot of the story? What's the conflict? And then, they're going around in circles telling you like how cool this guy is, how amazing he is. Not the same way sometimes I see queries where everyone's telling like, my book is going to do this. It's going, to tackle this area of the market. It's going to do this and that. It's about friendship, love, and relationships, but it's not actually telling me anything about the characters. It's not telling me about these relationships and things that they're describing. Sometimes a query does not know the market at all. And I mean that to say that, sorry, there's people coming into the room, trying to admit them all. Markets change in publishing. And one of some things I see is that some people are coming in with books that just don't fit in with the current market. And I don't say to discourage anyone who's like, well, there's not not to say that markets don't shift and change all the time. But if you are writing, sorry, I'm trying to figure out like the best example for this, and I have 5 different ones starting in my head. So when I say don't know the market, I should be specific. Don't know the market for the genre they're writing in. For example, fantasy books, there is an expected word count. You can go a little higher, like 150,000 words. If you're coming in with a 300,000 word fantasy, and yes, that has happened, that's telling me you don't know the market for fantasy, because, even, people who write very long fantasy works, they don't go up to the 300,000 word count. At least not until later in their career, when they've established that they can hold a reader's attention with that much book. So, and also likewise, if you're writing something too short, something like 30,000 is probably more of a novella than a novel. And I don't represent novellas, and so that's not a good fit for me. On that note, sometimes I reject people because they did not follow submission guidelines. They went to my direct email versus the query manager, which is, I do that for a reason, because it's easier for me to organize queries and see people I have not responded to. Sometimes they query me with a project in an area I do not represent at all. For example, I don't do middle grade, I don't do graphic novels, I don't do memoirs, and still people come to me with those types of projects. And in a connection to, I see this a lot with young adult and middle grade authors. Sometimes people get confused about the markets. Sometimes I have someone come to me, they have a 12-year-old protagonist and they try to tell me it's young adult. And I have to explain to them, 12-year-olds, that's a middle grade market. You should be querying agents who represent middle grade. And the third reason why I reject is that a query simply just does not appeal to me. Either the taste, just the subgenre, just like my general mood. That's a very, very subjective thing, you know, because even though I put it in my manuscript wish list things that I'm looking for, and then someone could come to me like, I have something that fits that exactly, I read it, I still don't feel that connection of excitement that it makes me want to read. Also, sometimes, you know, life circumstances can affect my mood for reading. For example, like, you know, if I had a dog and my dog recently passed away and someone came to me with with a story about a dog that dies, I'm probably not going to be in the good headspace for that. So I'm probably going to reject. So from those three reasons I gave you, one of them was like very subjective, you know, it was just about my taste, my genre, mood, things, you know, no one here is a mind reader, at least I hope not. So that part is out of your control. But the first two things, you know, making sure your query is well written, making sure they're following the agent's submission guidelines, those are things that are in your control. And you should not give an agent any reason to discount you on technicality, you know. And even I just said that, you know, sometimes tastes are very subjective, but if you have a very well written query, it could be the one where I'm like, well, you know, I normally don't go for, you know, sci-fi cop mysteries, but this guy described the story in such a compelling way that I'm like, let me give it a chance. Let me check it out. Maybe I'm going to be surprised and find a new area that I'm going to be interested in representing. So now we're going to actually talk about what goes in a query letter. So obviously, basic information that should go in a query letter is, you know, your title, your name, your genre, your word count, comparable titles. Comparable titles is an area I see a lot of authors get tripped up about because it's very hard to try to compare your work to something else that's on the market. So the basic things about comp titles is they have to be from the last 2 to 3 years. And they have to be sort of similar to your work, either in style, tone, plot, or characters, or all those 4 things. It's okay if you find something that's just like that. But the key to that is for comp titles show a couple of different things. One is that they show the agent like, hey, you know, there's a market for my book. This book that I'm comparing myself to, it was a success, or, you know, it did very well. And my book is similar to that book. So therefore, my book has a very good chance of being a success, or at least doing very well. And it's also a shorthand for an agent to get a feel for what your book is about without having to read the whole thing. It's sort of thinking like, you know, your X meets Y thing. Like if I tell someone, you know, Squid Game is a Netflix show that's really popular right now. You might have had friends or family describe to you know, like, oh, Squid Game is so great. It's sort of like Hunger Games, South Korea with, you know, the class analysis themes from Parasite. You know, that's, you know, that sort of X meets Y. That's people, you know, they're giving you something that's familiar. And so that way you have sort of an idea of what you're going to get into before you watch the show. So you know what to expect. And that way you know what to get excited about. And so the other thing about comp titles is that this is a tricky part. People often ask, is like, well, you know, can I use books that are like really mega bestsellers, like the Percy Jackson series, the Hunger Games series, Harry Potter, The Martian, you know, big titles that, you know, are, you know, blockbuster success books, or that have been adapted for TV and film. And it sort of feels sometimes if you go in trying to say like, my book is like the Hunger Games, it's sort of like either you're showing that you're a little out of touch because the Hunger Games came out, God, like 10 years ago. So it's been a while for that to be used as it's not as recent. It's not as for another book. And also there's sort of this fear that you're sort of being a little, I don't know what to call it. I don't want to call it arrogant, but it's sort of like overly optimistic that your book is the one. And it's not to say that agents aren't looking for the book to be the one that could break out and become a runaway bestseller. But I would say you can still use big name comp titles or even classic titles. For example, you know, if you want to use a Jane Austen book or something that came out 20 years ago, I'm trying to think, like the Poisonwood Bible, you can use titles like that as a comp, but you need to have something more recent from the last 2 to 3 years to compare yourself to. Because again, you need to show that your book can fit in the current marketplace, or as the marketplace is emerging, that your book would have a place in it. The next bit is you want to obviously share about the plot and the premise. You know, what's the story about? What are the stakes? You know, what's interesting about it? And obviously your biography, you want to share about yourself. So for some authors, you know, if you're still starting to get into writing, you may not have the same credentials as, you know, you were published in this magazine, or you studied at this MFA, or you went to this workshop. So bio can just be a place where you just show off your personality. I remember I have a client, his bio was something like, I'm a software engineer living in Austin, Texas. I love, you know, making craft beer and doing yoga, although not at the same time. And that was a little bit funny. That showed his personality to me. And so even if he, you know, he didn't have like all these credits from magazines and journals, it was just like that one thing that sparked. Was like, hey, you know, this guy, I already feel like I know him a little bit. Sorry, I just skipped ahead. Yeah, basic info. To continue off of that, if you're writing genre fiction, I would encourage you to be specific on the subgenre, because military science fiction is very different from epic fantasy. Romantic comedy is very different from, you know, a supernatural romance. You want to be, as an agent is reading your query letter, you will sort of want them to already forming your book in their mind, just by sketching this outline. You know, if I tell you something's going to be a grim, dark fantasy, you're already going to have expectations for it. You know, you're going to be picturing a very desolate setting, you know, very, you know, morally ambiguous characters, things like that. So even before you get to describing the plot, I'm already thinking like, okay, I know what you expect. I know who I'm expecting to see. And I know when this character comes in, like I can probably guess which tropes they fit in. And that, you know, that's going to help me see the story in a long view. Word count. Definitely to research what's expected for your genre. Again, I mentioned that fantasy books generally, you know, 150 words is usually like the longest fantasy books that I've seen. And again, you know, you don't want to be overshooting or undershooting yourself. And so generally, you know, word counts have a certain range. Again, you can look at your comp titles for examples. Like, you know, if you are writing a young adult romantic comedy, you know, take a look at several young adult romantic comedies to see how long or short they are. And likewise, that goes for any genre as well. For nonfiction, this is a little bit different because, you know, you're not making up a whole world. So the things you need to address in your query letter is, who is the target audience for this book? And I don't mean that to say that, you know, you shouldn't use like Google search results show that 2.1 million people, you know, 2.1 results show up for the, you know, people who love dogs. You know, that's not really a target audience. A target audience, like, you know, would be something like, you know, there are over 200,000 members in the ASPCA, you know, members who donate to the ASPCA. You know, there are these books written by, you know, for dog lovers. And, you know, because you need to be talking about what need is this book fulfilling. You know, if you're writing a book about, you know, how to take care of foster cats, you know, you need to be, you know, showing the agent, you know, why is this book important to get on the market? You know, if it's talking about foster cats, you know, there's a place where you can show off some stats, like showing that, you know, cat adoptions have surged, you know, 25% since over the course of the last year. You know, that's an actual stat that's more important to show the need for your book versus than doing a general like Google search results show this number of things. In the chat one, I hope I'm not talking too fast. And if I am, please do say so, because I want to make sure I'm not speeding through things. Plot overview, expanding that a little bit. Things you want to talk about in your career. What are the stakes, the major conflicts, you know, obviously your main character and their objective. And this is very hard, you know, because usually a query letter is usually like around 250, 500 words. So, you know, I know it's very difficult for people to sort of, especially if you are doing a genre work like science fiction or fantasy that involves a lot of world building. You're trying to be like, how do I explain this, like, you know, Asian inspired fantasy world where there are rockets and robots without taking up the whole 500 words to tell you about it. And so again, that's why comp titles are very helpful. They can help sketch in parts of your world. That way you can save your word count for doing the most important parts, like describing your characters and their stakes. I would suggest thinking about your typical cover copy. You know, you pick a book at the bookstore or you look at a listing online, You know, they give you enough information where they tell you about the world, the character, what they want, what's stopping them, and they give you like a little hook to, you know, be like, you know, so and so must decide what she's willing to sacrifice to save the world. And that's enough for you to want to keep going, because you're sort of like, yeah, what is she going to sacrifice to save the world? If I know, you know, her parents have been kidnapped by the evil regime and her love interest has betrayed her, you know, I care. The same still goes for nonfiction. It's a little bit different because, you know, obviously nonfiction, you are writing about factual information, so it feels weird to sort of describe it in a fictionalized way. But you know, if you're writing a memoir about yourself, you know, you can, you know, you still need to, you're telling the story. You know, if I'm going through the Eat, Pray, Love, even though I actually don't remember that plot that well, but, you know, I believe, you know, she was recently divorced or something like that, and she decided to take a trip to Italy and, you know, and India, and basically revitalize herself. And I think, you know, she went into, you know, why did she go on this trip? Why did she believe that this trip would have been fulfilling for her? And, you know, giving a little bit about the adventures she had along the way. If you were doing narrative nonfiction, for example, if you're shedding light on a subject, like let's say you're doing a history of the golden age of Hollywood, you need to explain, like, you know, the golden age of Hollywood was this period of time, you know, where this and this, all this happened. And, you know, why is it important to care about it today? That's basically functions of your plot overview. And again, even for nonfiction works, you know, you can go to a bookstore or check out an online listing and look at how those nonfiction works are described. And you'll notice that they still write them in a way that isn't just like this book is about, you know, the number of trees that are dying in the American Southwest. You know, they present the information that makes it exciting and it gets someone emotionally invested, interested in figuring out what happens next. So bio, again, this is the place where you brag about yourself a little bit. If you have been published before, no matter how big or small, if you've won any awards, even if, again, no matter how big or small, I mean, writing related, of course, you know, if you went to a conference and you entered one of the contests the conference is host, and, you know, you were a finalist in this category, share so. If you were previously published or self-published, you know, share your sales records, so long as they are impressive, you know, 300 sales in a year, that's not that much. 3,000 sales in a year, that's something to brag about, because, you know, that shows that you've been doing how you were able to sell something on your own. Endorsements, if you have any, for example, I think what you guys were talking about in the chat before about, you guys talked a little bit about networking and beta readers. You know, if you are in a writer's group where a friend, you know, may be published already and they're willing to say something about you, where, you know, they read your work and while you were workshopping it, and they said, you know, author so-and-so is in my writer's group and she said this was great, whatever, that's something good to know. If you attended workshops like, you know, Clarion, obviously the Isles workshop is very famous, but there's also, you know, other major workshops that if you attended, you know, you want to talk about. And if you're a nonfiction writer, you want to share your platform, especially because you need to be selling why you are the authority here. You know, whether you're a professor, if you are a member of an important society, you know, if you've been building your social media profile that you have now X amount of followers, that's something definitely want to share. For fiction, your social media profile does not matter as much. I mean, obviously, I would encourage you to get involved in social media, mostly to build relationships with other writers, because, you know, you are all coming up together. You never know down the line when a friend might be the one to, you know, introduce you or recommend you to an agent or to a contest or a conference or a workshop or whatever, or you might, you know, be giving each other blurbs down the line. And even just right now in the present, you know, you guys can provide each other encouragement and support, especially when you're querying. So that's the reason I recommend social media. But I understand social media can be very toxic, so take care of yourself. If you are also writing, if you're planning to write a memoir or an essay collection, you want to show off your published credits. From fiction side too, as well, obviously you want to show off any published credits if you have, but for memoirs and essays, you want to show that, you know, most of the time essay collections are collections of previously published work. So you want to show where these things are published. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, if you don't have any of these things, if you don't have any of these credentials, this is a place where you can show off your personality, your hobbies, your interests. And I would also strongly mention to share what else you're working on, because that might be a chance to connect. For example, you know, you might have a bio at the end is like, you know, I'm so-and-so, I'm a you know, accountant based in Connecticut. I'm also working on a romantic comedy about a comedian who goes back to her small town to record her Netflix special and the awkwardness that ensues. And that's something I just made up off the top of my head, although I would like that story if you guys have that. And so, you know, as an agent, you might be reading like, well, I didn't like the query you gave me, but you know, you describe something else you're working on, and like, that sounds pretty interesting to me. And actually, I will say that's actually how I got one of my clients that I signed this year. No, yeah, this year. He came to me with a fantasy novel and I did not like it. and he signed it off saying to me, I'm also working on a coming of age novel based on my experience as an undocumented immigrant. And that made me set up because I have a connection to that. And so I reached out to him, you know, I didn't like this fantasy, but that young adult fiction you're writing about, that seems very interesting. I would love to see it. And sure enough, that was the project we connected on, and that's the project that I signed him for. So never, always give yourself a little bit something that, you know, might be a chance to connect on something down the line. So now we're crossing into what are the do's and don'ts of query letters. Again, if you've been querying for a while, you may already know some of these things. But, you know, do include this essential info, you know, the basic plot info, bio, everything that we just talked about here. I'd mentioned you want to try to keep it 200 or 500 words is an ideal length. Please double check your spelling and who you're addressing, because I can't tell you how many times I have gotten queries that start off, dear, not my name, like dear Julia, dear so-and-so. And I am just sort of have this feeling where like, I don't know if this was meant to me. I don't know if this is a copy and paste error. So I'm going to ignore this because I don't know if it was for me. Spelling, please double check spelling. It goes a long way. I am nice about it because my maiden name, Velazquez, has like 6 different types of spelling, and I know autocorrect sometimes goes to the different spelling. And so I personally don't discount too much for that, because I know mistakes happen when you're typing. So I'd be a little nice about that, but you know, some agents may be a little more prickly about that. And again, you should show that you know who you're addressing. Feel free to be creative with your structure a little bit of the query letter. I know oftentimes you sort of, you know, get into a rhythm of like, you know, hi, I'm so-and-so, you know, querying with my novel. That's a 100,000 word fantasy novel. That's X meets Y. And then here's the plot. And then here's my bio. And thank you for your time. Feel free, you know, obviously that works. That structure does work. I won't lie to you that, you know, I have some clients who did that structure. But I've also seen clients who get to be more creative, where they introduce the plot first. And then, you know, they get something exciting. I've seen one that was like, that, you know, this was on Query Shark. This is not an actual query that I saw, but Query Shark is a blog that highlights query letters and gives advice for people. And this one of the queries that was praised on the blog was one that she sort of did a countdown with like, you know, 7 rings to rule the world, you know, 6 days to end the world from ending, you know, 1 person to stop them all, and that person is this, you know, just getting a little creative with how, you know, you describe a plot, you know. I would, and then as I mentioned before, part of your bio, you want to mention the platform you may have. If you have a very large social media following, definitely want to highlight that. If you've been published anywhere, that's your bibliography, you want to definitely mention that. Again, if you've attended any special workshops or conferences, definitely want to highlight that. Don'ts are, I think, as I've touched before, you know, don't just tell about the book, show it. And by that, I mean, don't do my book is about a man on the verge of, you know, catastrophe. And it's a story about love and friendship. You know, going too much about that, I mean, you can do a line or 2 about that, but like, you know, if you're spending the whole paragraph telling me about all the things your book is about, I mean, they're not actually telling me the plot or the character, the stories. And on the same note, don't spend too much time talking about why you wrote this book. I obviously do want to hear if this story has a personal connection to you. If you're writing a story that's sort of loosely based on your life, or something that, an event that affected you deeply, you can have a line or two of that, this is based on my life, or this is an issue I care deeply about. But, again, don't spend the whole career talking about like, I wrote this book to do this, I wrote this book to change lives. That doesn't tell me anything about the actual book you wrote. This should go without saying, but please do not trash other books or authors, especially since you don't know if the agent who is reading your query might actually be a fan of those books and those authors, and it's the classic Mean Girls quote, is that telling someone they're ugly doesn't make you pretty. The same way goes for, talking badly of how a book isn't good doesn't make yours great. Don't spend that time that you having a query letter trashing other people. Though I did say that, feel free to get creative with your structure. Don't rely on gimmicks. And by that, I mean, I've had really strangely formatted queries where someone wrote to me in the voice of as if they were having a back and forth exchange with their main character. And it was just really, the structure was such that like I still could not tell what the actual story was, because again, it was so focused on this dynamic between the author interacting with his main character that it was more so focused on the character showing off their sense of humor. And it didn't help me develop a connection to the story, because it was just this guy sort of showing off, these jokes he was making. And so if you are going to get creative with your structure, or, do something a little bit different, is that you have to make sure that your story is first and foremost at the forefront, because that's what an agent's looking at. I'm not, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're going to be reading about. So to help demonstrate do's and don'ts, I pulled some queries from Query Shark. Again, this is a website run by Janet Reed. It doesn't seem like she's really active with it anymore, but she has a very rich archive that you can feel free to go back and look at other queries that were submitted, the critiques she has for them, what were they were doing right, what were they were doing wrong. So in this query, this is a sci-fi novel. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the first paragraph, we introduce a main character, he's apparently being interrogated, he's facing off some guy. They are sparring, they're sparring, the interrogations are worse, it's torture. And so it's like, okay, first paragraph is kind of interesting, this guy is presumably held captive. And then the second paragraph switches to something about his past, like, oh, he was, he's a young officer, he's visited tons of star systems. He's on this place called Castic. I don't know where this is exactly, he's in a prison camp. And then in our last paragraph, we suddenly switch point of views to Mirko, the guy who was interrogating him. And then it goes back to Drew, that he learned much in war. And, this story, it's telling the wrong details. That's the main issue with it, is that this stuff is interesting backstory that, but like he's focusing on all the wrong places. Is that, the most important things is that, Drew and his shipmates, they're in a prison camp. There is a war between these planets. They have to figure out a way to escape. They have to, find a way to get out of this place. That's where the plot is. But again, what we have here in this paragraph is like, he's telling us a bunch of things about his story, but they're not coming together to form what the actual plot is. And that would actually get us interested to find out what's going to happen next. And as I mentioned, also the thing that this query did not have is that there were not comp titles. That was, made it difficult to get a picture of what this is similar to, so I could have expectations, With the word count, 120,000 is usually pretty long for science fiction. So comp titles will help contextualize. Like, for example, the Expanse series by S.A. Corey, it is pretty long because he does a lot of world building. If this guy had used the Expanse as a comp title, and then I got to the number of the word count, I'd be like, oh, okay, well, I know the Expanse is pretty long. So if this guy is doing something in that vein, that means he has some like really interesting world building that's going to be happening. So I will not knock that for that. Going into the next query, another issue that a lot of people have is that there's too much detail. And so, and this one, it's 1984, we're in Oklahoma City, the Waco siege O.J. Simpson trial are in the headlines. This young Choctaw boy, he has been orphaned. This investigator is the job to save this boy's father's life, and he is investigating a certain crime. And he, this is also a personal connection to him because he's also Choctaw. And he has forced people who are going to be part of his investigation. And then it lists all these different characters and their occupations. And then it goes together, these people just might be able to solve the crime. And then it gives a hint that on April 19th, the Waco, some big thing is about to happen. And it's sort of a little generic, life will never be the same. Well, that's sort of, all of this sort of comes to what I like to call plot or character soup, where there's just a lot of details to sift through. And like as I'm reading, like my brain is getting clouded with all these details, and I'm struggling to figure out, well, what's the important stuff to actually figure out, what is the story hinging on. So again, we need a basic overview of the plot. We don't need to know every single character, every single bit of plot, every bit of world building we need here. We just need to know the most essential parts to get it and to get invested. And one thing about this guy, he needed a more recent comp. Don DeLillo, I believe these two titles he mentioned published in the late 90s. And so even though this query from Query Shark, I believe was from 2005 or 2007, again, he needs to show off titles that were from the last 2-3 years of his time. And I am going to switch gears and talk to you about queries that actually became clients, so you can see examples of queries that were successful in grabbing an agent's attention, at least this agent's attention. So this person, she said, it was lovely meeting you at this conference that she attended. We had met in a pitch workshop, so I had asked her to send me some pages. She gives the word count, the genre, it's a young adult thriller, the title. She gives comp titles, Stephanie Perkins, Kate Allender. She gives the plot, the main character, here is her world. Here's the status quo that she's starting off with. She's starting off, she has post-traumatic stress disorder from a car accident. And then her hook line is that someone pretending to be her boyfriend is texting her, and she has no idea if it's his ghost, if she's having a nervous breakdown, or if it's someone actually stalking her. And then here's an interesting conflict in the story, is that no one knew that this boyfriend was abusive. And that's sort of lends an interesting layer on this character because she has a secret that she thought was a secret and someone knows it. And now there's this question of like, who is this person who knows this very dark secret of hers, and why are they using it against her? What's the purpose of that? So that's a hook that, leaves me wanting more. And so again, she let me know that this book was a finalist in the Writers League of Texas contest in the young adult category. She's had fiction published in these places, and she let me know, about herself, that, she had a master's degree, and, that helps lend her story because, this is a story about someone struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I can feel pretty confident that she is depicting this issue very accurately or very sympathetically. And so that's something that I signed with. And now this book is under contract to Philomel. I wish I could share with you guys the pre-order link, but it is not up yet. So, but keep an eye on it. One book that I can show you a little bit more tangible things for is my client, Ben Riggs. He came to me, again, someone introduced me to him. That's why building your network amongst other writers is very important. You guys could help each other out making introductions with agents. And so this was a nonfiction project. And so again, he gives me a brief summary. It's about Dungeons and Dragons, the company. And so he starts with like a very strong hook. In 1997, Dungeons and Dragons almost died. And he gives a little bit of reason why. There's disastrous business decisions. They're on bankruptcy. And then, he sort of leads in like, I've been interviewing eyewitnesses to figure out why. And so these interviews, so he has been doing work for this book. He's shown that he is the authority on the subject. He is the guy who's been talking to the people who were actually there during this event. So that's why he has this true story of what happened to D&D that no one knows, but which every D&D fan will want to know. Again, he's showing me the audience. Dungeons and Dragons is a very, big role-playing game. It's a very big franchise. So, and I know without even Googling it, that there is a market for D&D fans. It's growing so much in popular culture. And so he gives me this title of his book, and he tells me a little bit about himself. He's a journalist, he's a writer, he's a podcaster. He has worked for this website. He has a podcast. It's been downloaded this many times. He was nominated for an industry award. So again, he showed me his platform. He's like, I am the authority of the subject, and I have people that I can reach out to when this book comes out, like people who would be interested in following me and seeing what I wrote. And so again, he had a book proposal. He let me know his word count. He let me know, I have written this much so far that I can share with you. Again, for nonfiction works, most nonfiction works are sold in proposal, although, agents will want to see several sample chapters. If you're writing a memoir, usually it's easier for you to just write the whole thing and then go from there, but you can submit on proposal as well. For nonfiction projects like this, sometimes authors will wait to see if they can get an agent and a publisher interested, and because sometimes there is a financial investment required. This guy Ben was lucky; he lives in Wisconsin, where a lot of the people who used to work at Dungeons and Dragons are still based, so it was not as much for him. But we have clients who are doing research projects on something that happened in the Civil War era, so that involves more travel. And the goal is that to get a publisher to pay to write the book. So, if he was writing to me about something like that, he might just share with me, like, I have a complete book proposal. My goal is to write this book 100,000 words, and I've completed the first few chapters, that I can share with you, but maybe just be the chapters he was able to write just by doing research online without having to go to specific sites to do this work. But yes, this book has sold and is coming out next year. So if you're a D&D fan, highly recommend. It was very fascinating. And so now we're going to switch gears and talk about opening pages. So what am I looking for as I am reading? I am looking for a strong voice, a strong hook, and the most important thing, a reason to keep going. I know first pages can be really, really hard, especially when you get sort of that writing advice where it's like, you have to grab the reader's attention the first page, although never go past it. I remember when I was in school and we would do those exercises like, write the best first line or write the best first 10 words. And really your first pages, I would encourage you to think of them more as part of a whole rather as individual parts, because, when you pick up a book for the first time, I'm sure when you give at least the whole page a chance, because sometimes style, rhythm is not that first sentence that shows all of that at once. You take the whole first page or first couple pages to really develop the rhythm and the world of the story. So when I'm reading first pages, I give the whole first page a look. I'm looking for these things. The reason to keep going is the most important bit. And I mean that in the sense is that in the first pages, you want to be setting up, the stakes of this world, the status quo. Give me a reason to care about this, that makes me want to keep going. I think about, because even the best premise, you could have the most interesting premise that fits my manuscript wish list down to the T. But if the pages don't do anything to, expand on that, it's not going to work out. You're not going to get an agent excited to read. Of course, opening pages are very subjective. I'm sure everyone here knows that there has been a book that all your group has raved about, and you checked it out, and you're like, what's the big deal? I do not see this. But there are basics that propel a reader forward versus stalling them. So we're going to go into a little about do's and don'ts. So what should the opening pages do? You want to be setting up the world, your time period, especially if you're writing something that's historical, or if you are set in even a fantasy world. Are you writing a medieval-esque fantasy? Are you writing more of a steampunk fantasy? Are you writing, fantasy periods? Do you have a sort of time period that they're set in? Because the medieval period of the 1500s is very different from London in the 1800s, and you want to be setting up clues for your reader to what the physical surroundings are, and you want to be setting up the current status quo. Is your character a loser, quote unquote? Are they put upon? Are they downtrodden? Also conversely, it could be the opposite. Are they good at their job? Are they good at what they do? Are they confident in themselves? Who is the person we're going to be rooting for? Who are we not? because you have to want your reader to follow these people for the next 100 or so pages. Similarly, you want to be setting up your voice and style. This is usually connected to the character because your character is the one who demonstrates your voice, your style. I'm sure we're all very familiar for like with Bridget Jones's Diary, you know, was written in the very dry, sarcastic British wit. You may remember, even in third person, you can still show off personalities in that way. Like it's been a while, but I do remember Harry Potter is that he was, you know, he was a little sarcastic. He was a little snarky a little bit. And so even though that book was written in third person, you could still show that off. And the way, and that's connected to, you know, the rhythm, your syntax, you know, how are you giving asides? Are you showing off a sense of humor or some bitterness? Opening pages, I, you know, sort of hint the bigger stakes, but again, I want to show that you can show the smaller stakes too. The thing about stakes is that you may have seen that there's a writing chart, it's like the stakes build up against each other. Like there's always a conflict or an obstacle for the character to address, even if it's small stuff. Like for example, you know, they're late to work and their commute, you know, the subway doors just close in front of them. You know, that's that's still a stake that you can, you know, get the pages about. It's like everyone, you know, if you can show like the nervousness, the panic, the anxiety, the frustration, you know, that's very relatable and that can get someone going. It's like, you know, especially if we know there's something important down the line, you know, there's an important presentation to give, or that, you know, there's an urgent delivery that needs to be made, you know, that could get a reader invested like, okay, well, how's this guy gonna, you know, how's this guy gonna pull through? How is he gonna get to where he needs to go? And so to expand more on setting up the world, especially for genre settings, because genre settings, fantasy, science fiction, and the like, you are creating an entirely new world, and you have to like take what's in your head and put it in the reader's head, and whatever that may be. Again, I mentioned like medieval England versus 1800s London. You need to be giving clues for your reader and the way the characters dress, the technology they use, the method of transportation, the way they talk, so on and so forth. You know, we here in 2021 talk very differently than what they would have, you know, in 1900 or even like 1960s and 1980s. If you watch films from that era, you notice the cadence and the rhythm of dialogue, even like for, you know, what were then contemporary stories, is very different from, you know, contemporary stories here. You know, our voices and our style of dialogue have changed. One example I always like to give people, it's the Game of Thrones versus Shrek. That's an easy way to sort of think about how to do world setup. So Game of Thrones, if you watch the TV show, you remember the pilot episode, you know, we get these beautiful visuals of the landscape, the settings, these gorgeous lingering camera angles of the dresses, the knights in armor, you know, seeing, you know, the, oh my God, I forgot the name of the castle. It's not a castle, but where they lived, the North, where they lived, the landscape of the North, you know, the daily activities that the noble houses did, versus Shrek, which is also in a medieval-esque fantasy period. But, you know, remember the beginning of Shrek, what does it start with? We start with him reading the fairy tale, and he's like, what a load of crap. And then he flushes the toilet, and All-Star plays. And, you know, it's more humorous, it's more irreverent. And that's the same way, you know, when you write your book, is that you are sort of getting the reader in the mood for what's about to happen, you know, because the expectations, the mood for Shrek is very different from the mood and expectations you have when you're going into watching Game of Thrones. And so books are obviously much different, because unless you're writing a graphic novel, you don't have visual cues to give the reader, you know, a shortcut for like, you know, we're in a castle, it's dark, so you know something gritty is about to happen, versus, you know, something that's lighter colored and there's pop music playing. So you have to be doing a little bit of work in that regard. But even opening pages, you know, you don't start off with doing like, you know, in the world of, you know, Satin Beard, you know, this and this reigns, whatever. You know, if you're watching your character go about your daily life, you know, again, you know, what clothes are they wearing? You know, what technology are they using? You know, how are they getting around? How are they talking to people? Because again, you know, you show off the world in this way and the way your character interacts with it. And so you want to make sure that your opening pages are focusing on developing that world building in the background, and while also, you know, showing, you know, getting the reader invested in emotion what's going to happen next. setting up your character's voice / style. I touched this a little bit before. The characters are essentially your mouthpiece. You're telling the story through them. Their voice is the one that's taking over. Again, this is very much easier for writing in first person because, you can show off their personality, if they're snarky, if they're anxious, if they're bitter. But even if you're writing in third person, you can show this off in their dialogue and their inner monologue and their thoughts and feelings. Here's the crux that a lot of people stumble into, especially when they're writing unlikable characters. Unlikable characters are very tricky to do, but they can still be done. You just need to do something that's mesmerizing about their unlikability. One of my clients, her name is Joy Landendorfer. Her debut novel published earlier this year. It's called Right Back Where We Started From. And it follows 3 generations of very unlikable women in California from the gold rush to World War II. And they were, as I mentioned, they were unlikable. They were greedy, they were selfish, they were very short-sighted. And so the question is, how then were these characters so compelling to you that you wanted to work with her and it got published? And it's because Joy crafted these characters in a way that made their unlikability sort of compelling. And so one trick that she did was that there was sort of a little bit of humor in their unlikability, where they were just so self-aggrandizing and a little delusional that it was kind of funny to see them stumble upon the world, stumble throughout the world and, so convinced of their superiority and their greatness. Though when they got the smackdown from life that, that put them in their place, it was kind of a little funny to see them get the comeuppance. And also conversely, that it was also something kind of, admirable about how unapologetic they were in their selfishness, that it was sort of, kind of like watching a train wreck in the happening, where you're sort of just like, I can't look away. Like, I just need to know, like, is she gonna pull it off? Is she gonna do the things that she says she would? I would liken this a little bit to the Kardashians. If there are any reality TV fans here, is that, I myself, I always dogged the Kardashians. And then one day I was bored, so I sat down and started watching some episodes. And they were extremely charismatic. They were somehow even and silly. So even though I knew, they're a bit vapid, they're, not, super talented that merits all his attention. They have this very powerful charisma that gets you to keep tuning in. And then you wake up and you realize you're eight seasons deep. So same way for your unlikable characters. You need to do something that compels the reader to keep going with them, whether it is that they're, funny, even intentionally or unintentionally so. But, sometimes, it sounds a little mean, but sometimes, we characters are funny because we kind of like to mock them, but it makes us feel better about ourselves. They sort of embody the insecurities that we have in such an outward way that you kind of hate them and admire them for being so unabashedly themselves. Another way to write unlikable characters is that maybe they have a sympathetic backstory or a goal. For example, I'm thinking of Squid Game, which is on Netflix right now, and I just started watching it. The main character, he is a compulsive gambler. He's lazy. He's a huge slacker, but he loves his daughter. He cares about her so deeply. And so with that gives a hook to his character where, even I think I would not want to hang out with this guy, and I definitely would not lend him money. That love he has for his daughter is very sympathetic and gets me, like, well, you know what, maybe I'm going to root for this guy for him to come out big winner. For speaking of humor, if you are familiar with Curb Your Enthusiasm, you know the Larry David character, that where Larry David plays a fictionalized version of himself, where he often gets into awkward situations because he is obnoxious or awkward or rude, and sometimes he is actually the right person in the situation that he didn't want to move his seat in the movie theater because why should he paid for that seat, but he's so rude about it. So even though you're on his side technically, you're sort of caught in between. It's like, I agree with him. He should not have to give up his seat in the movie theater, but he's being so rude about it. And so the sort of push-pull you have between the reader and sort of like, you keep going along. It's like, maybe he's going to, apologize, or maybe something's going to happen that I can firmly be on his side, that I'm, compelled to see what happens next because, I want to kind of root for him, but I know it shouldn't. So that's one way to address unlikability. I know, sorry, I just scrolled fast without meaning to. unlikable characters are something that's really hard to do, especially I often see in pages is that people try to do like the Dr. House thing where their character is just so obnoxiously mean to everybody. And don't do that in the opening pages. You want to spread that out, because again, if we're making the decision, do I want to follow this guy across the next 100, 200 pages? And if I'm getting in the first couple pages, this guy's just an asshole to everybody, I'm not really interested in seeing what happens next. But if you spread it out, he's, like if you watch an episode of House, like, yes, he's rude, but then he's also brilliant. He does something that saves a patient's life or saves a colleague's reputation. And then that's sort of like, okay, he's rude, but, he did these good things, so I will keep going with him. It's the same way you got to do that. You got to, I feel like authors, you feel a lot of pressure to show everything in the first 10 pages because you're really excited about your story. You really want to get the reader in there, but let things take time, let them develop, let them spread out. I often say in stories that everything's going to build on top of each other. So you don't have to worry about throwing everything in there at once. Let everything keep building. So going into do's and don'ts of opening pages. So this is, someone just asked, why are writing unlikable characters so easy to write? My theory is that maybe that is because unlikable characters, they are everything you wish you could say, everything you wish you could do, without having, you don't have to suffer the consequences of actually doing it. Because I know if I walked into my workplace and I was, knocked everyone's coffee cups and I yelled at everyone, I would not have a job anymore. But if I was, writing a story, it's much easier to write the circumstances in which a character could get away to do that. Yeah, so if writing unlikable characters is easy for you, awesome for you. That's really, really great. And so I hope you're just, balancing that out in the first opening pages where you're giving a little bit about them, so not overloading it too much, their personality too much. Because again, if you made friends with someone the first time and they were just like very obnoxious, you would not want to hang out with them. Versus like, as you spend time with each other, yeah, someone may have the weird quirks, but you kind of see past for them and see like the good overall. So going into like we did for our queries, what are some do's and don'ts of opening pages? If the main character is an awful, sorry, going sort of on the subject of unlikable characters, so we'll go back to that slide so that way we won't have them. You mean if the main character is an awful person? Yes and no. For example, Hannibal Lecter is probably like one of the most worst people. He's a little cannibal and he's a murderer. But he is still like a very compelling character that, he has this whole series around him. It depends, it's up to you. If you want your main character to be an anti-hero, that's definitely something you can do. We have lots of examples of successful anti-heroes in literature. I was thinking of people like gray area, again, like someone who was sort of grumpy or nasty. I will caution you not to be overly so, because again, in real life, people are very rarely all bad. There is a mix of good within them. I see this most frequently in young adult fiction is that when writers create an antagonist for the main character, it goes into like a default bully who is just like, might as well be a mustache twirling villain. And, in real life, people are not that, they're not always that overt about their nastiness. I mean, if you are, then, God help you. But in fiction, we want to give our characters layers. So if they're all going to be nasty, do something with it. Either you can do something that has, like I mentioned, a sympathetic goal or backstory, or they're funny about it, because sometimes, it's kind of, sometimes the nastiest characters can have the best sense of humor, the best quips. And it's sort of like, I will let this slide. I will keep reading about this character because they're just so amusing to me that I want to hear from them again. Yeah, I think Schitt's Creek is a good example for characters that are unsympathetic, but yet are still so, especially if you remember from the beginning, the Rose family was very obnoxious, very self-important. And even so, I think David is probably an example of a character who still retained some of his unlikable qualities, but still was very likable, that, he's very fussy, he's very convinced of his own, great taste, and very stubborn. But he has something sympathetic about him. There are hints dropped throughout the season is that he's never really felt true love. His family, when they had their money, they were very isolated socially and emotionally from each other. And there was like a line about when he had boyfriends is that he they treated him badly. And so when the final seasons, as he gets into a serious relationship, it's really exciting to see that grow. Even when he does make mistakes, we're rooting for him, because we know that he has a sort of a sympathetic reason for why he acts this way, and he does make efforts to better himself. So before we go on to the next slide, if there are any other questions about this area, especially about unlikable characters? Okay. So we're going to go into the do's and don'ts for opening pages. So do you try to get as close as you can to some sort of compelling action or tension point? And I don't mean this like, we're at the edge of the cliff, you got to throw the one ring into the volcano. Like I said earlier in the beginning, sometimes you're running late for work, the subway doors close in on you, you have a very important presentation to give, your job is on the line. That's a compelling action or tension point. We got to get from point A to point B. Something even as small as that you're a bridesmaid in a wedding and you have to walk down the aisle and your shoes are wobbly and you had too much to drink. And so there's this fear you have that you're going to embarrass yourself as you walk down the aisle. One cliche that a lot of agents complain about is the waking up bit where, I wake up, I look in the mirror, I start my day. That's, it's overplayed for a reason. People have been doing it so many times. And, again, it's not that interesting of a starting point. You can start somewhere closer. I think an example I have is recently working with someone on their pages. And, her first thing was that, it's morning. It's a young adult novel. It's morning. Main character goes downstairs. She has a conversation with her mom about breakfast. She goes to school. That's kind of a boring layout because nothing is really happening in those pages. Is that she's literally just going about her day. There's not really an interesting, compelling point. And I had advised the author, her chapter 3, which is when the main character goes to the club meeting that kicks off the plot where she gets involved in a certain, service project. I suggest her start here. And this is the more interesting place. And you can still do all the things where you were doing in the first chapter, where you're sort of showing off the world of this person's life, where she's a slacker, she's apathetic, she doesn't have a lot going for her. And you can demonstrate that in the club meeting. If she's, everyone is chattering excitedly and she's like, slumped on her desk, doodling in her notebook, that still shows that, she's got a slacker attitude. She's not really caring about anything. And here in this club meeting where we, announce this big service project that's going to drive the rest of the plot, that's more exciting. That shows the stakes of the plot is that, sometimes, if she's doing it she needs to do this project to get a passing grade in this course so she can graduate high school, or, she's trying to impress this girl she has a crush on. Again, that's a compelling action or tension point. As I mentioned before, you want to ground your setting, especially if you are building a completely unique world. You want to try to sort of set it up. A sci-fi setting is very different from a fantasy setting, which is very different from a historical setting. You want to be setting it up, giving some details of the world. And again, you don't have to do like, it's 1885 in London, and I, put on my, undergarments, and I, go about, there's ways you can show off the setting just by having the character go out about, their actions. Again, if we're doing the guys in a rush to work, if we were doing this like in like London in the 1800s, is that, he's running down the cobblestone street. He almost gets hit by a carriage. He has to he gets mud on his, clothes, as someone is yelling at him in Cockney slang. That's showing the setting without having to be saying like, it's London. This stuff is going on. There's ways you can show off your setting without having to tell about it. Similarly, on a showing, not telling point of view, you want to be showing off your character's personality. Sorry, I'm just checking the time because I forgot how much time we have left. And you can demonstrate this through, oh crap, did we go over? It's 2:20. No one has said anything to me about it. Are we over? No one has said anything to me about it.
Yeah, we're 5 minutes over.
Okay.
I figured you were just gonna wrap it up, but our
Oh.
next breakout session is at 2:30. So
Okay. All right. I'm sorry we did not get a chance to do Q&A after all. I'm very sorry about that. So again, we'll just wrap up do's and don'ts here, and then hopefully at a later session we can all catch up.
I had a question. Can I email you my question?
Yeah, that works.
Okay,
for me.
thanks.
Yes, I will put my email here. I may not be able to get to everyone, but I feel really bad that we went over time. You can email me at susan@awfulagent.com and putting in the subject line the push to publish event if we didn't get to cover it. But finishing off the do's and don'ts, what you don't want to do in the opening pages, don't give off too much exposition, don't linger on unnecessary details or digressions. Again, that's a problem that hope that a lot of people do, is that they talk too much about one particular thing, like a setting or a character, without getting back to the main issue is, do you want to get back to your compelling, your action point. Likewise, don't micromanage the reader's visual eye. Again, that's connected to detail, is that most people try to describe every single thing that the characters is experiencing or seeing, that it ends up cluttering the reader's visual eye. Readers have imaginations, trust that they will do it. And again, your opening pages, I had touched on this before, is that you can let things build. The whole point of the opening pages is to get a person interested in wanting more. So don't feel like you have to address every single thing in the opening pages. And so with that, I think we will end this now, and so that the next session can begin. And so thank you, everyone. Apologies for going over time, and I hope that all of this information was useful to you in some way. And again, I put my email in the chat, so you can reach out to me. If you request the PowerPoint, again, email me, and then I will send it out to you. And that, well, I'll let the host take over to go on to the next session.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.